Hello everybody, welcome to presenting the Stella Prize Longlist. My name is Veronica Sullivan. I'm the Assistant Manager for the Stella Prize, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this event with these extraordinary writers. This event is presented in conjunction with the Digital Writers Festival, and we thank them very much for this magical technology that allows us to bring these authors to your computer screens. The Stella Prize celebrates Australian women's contribution to literature. It was awarded for the first time in 2013 to Carrie Tiffany for Mateship with Birds, and in 2014 the winner was Claire Wright for The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. The prize is worth $50,000 and both fiction and non-fiction books are eligible for entry. In just 2 years, and this is now our third year, the Stella Prize has already become a fixture on the Australian literary landscape, significantly boosting book sales and raising author profiles. We also conduct an annual Stella count, showing how many books by men and women are reviewed in major Australian newspapers and literary magazines. And last year, we launched a new education initiative, the Stella Prize Schools Program, which aims to promote women's writing and to equip boys and girls in years 7 to 12 with the skills to recognise and question gender disparities in literature. So before we get going with the readings, I'll just give you a little background on this year's prize. This year, the Stella Prize judges were critic and writer Karen Goldsworthy, who is the chair of the judges, journalist and broadcaster Caroline Baum, writer and lecturer Tony Birch, singer-songwriter Sarah Blasco, and acclaimed author Melissa Lukashenko. From more than 150 entries, they've selected 12 books for the Stella Prize longlist. The books on this year's longlist range far and wide, demonstrating the diversity and power of Australian women's writing. We are pleased tonight to welcome 9 of the longlisted authors. The Stella Prize longlist for 2015 is Foreign Soul by Maxine Beneba-Clark, The Strays by Emily Vito, The Invisible History of the Human Race by Christine Keneally, The Eye of the Sheep by Sophie Laguna, The Golden Age by Joan London, Lorinda by Alice Pung, Nest by Inga Simpson, Heat and Light by Ellen Van Neven, In My Mother's Hands by Biff Ward, and those are the 9 authors who are joining us tonight. And the other 3 books, Only the Animals by Caradwan Dovey, This House of Grief by Helen Garner, and Golden Boys by Sonia Hartnett. These 3 couldn't join us, but we congratulate them very warmly on their long listing. The first author who will be reading for us tonight is Sophie Laguna, whose book The Eye of the Sheep has been longlisted. And the judges said of Sophie's book that she faultlessly maintains the storytelling voice of Jimmy, who is oblivious in some ways and hauntingly knowing and observant in others. There are many places in which this story could tip over into sentimentality or melodrama, but Laguna's authorial control and intelligence keep the story on track and the reader engaged and empathic. And she manages both the humour and the darkness of this story with great sensitivity and precision. So now I'll hand over to Sophie to introduce her reading from The Eye of the Sheep. Oh, Sophie, you're still on mute.
I was just saying that the judge's description of the book works well as an introduction. Jimmy is a manic, anxious sort of a boy, but he's very lovable. And he sees the world in. I should be looking straight ahead, shouldn't I? I keep looking at you.
You can look wherever you like.
So he sees the world in wonderfully original ways, and he's very quirky, and he's very vulnerable, and he lives with his mum and dad, Gavin and Paul, in Altona near the oil refinery where Jimmy's dad works. And about halfway through the story, Jimmy suffers a terrible loss, and I guess The Eye of the Sheep is the story of how Jimmy has to save himself. I think I'll just read from the beginning. That kind of makes the most sense to me. Part 1. It was Saturday morning and I was doing the gardening with Mum. My dad was still asleep. When will he wake up, Mum? Mum, when will Dad wake up? I asked as she watered the fern, its tentacles bouncing under the pressure. If I stood close enough, I could hear the same tentacles inside my mum, waving at the dust in her air ducts. Has he had enough yet, Mum? Does he still need more rest? My dad worked at the mobile refinery in Altona, getting rid of the rust. Rust came back every time it rained, but even if it left my dad raw, his skin corroded so you could see the fibres that joined him, he didn't stop scraping. He learned at the Western Car Yard in Laverton. Mum said all the Flick brothers knew how to work. You help me in the garden, love, and let Dad have a bit of quiet. He'll be tired after the night shift. Here, take the hose. Mum passed me the hose, and I felt the water pushing its way through the rubber tube. The hose gave it a direction. I aimed at the leaves, and then I aimed at the path, blasting leaves against the edges. Keep it on the plants, Jimmy. That's the boy, said Mum. I watched as the leaves drank, absorbing fluid and light and growing greener as water dripped down the stems and back into the ground. When Mum was getting her gloves and her kneeling pad from the laundry, I let go of the hose. It whipped and wriggled like a snake under attack, and water flooded the paving. I grabbed the hose snake by the neck and felt the water rushing through my fist. I looked at the soil refining to mud. I heard the plants drinking, their stems gulping back the drips. The darker the soil, the more it had to drink. It processed water the same way the refinery processed oil. I got to see it close up one day. Dad left his thermos behind, and Mum took Robbie and me and drove it into work for him as a surprise. Mum parked the holding in Mobile Car Park A, and through the high wire fence I saw the inside of a body with intestines made of steel and no skin around its precious metals. It smoked grey clouds, and a flame blasted from the end of a huge pole like a giant pilot light. It was the same network that was in the rabbit that my Uncle Rodney shot and pulled open. The same network that was in my mum, the same network that was in me, in plants and leaves and machinery and all shops and underground in the earth's core. It was the whole inside of all living things, but on the outside. And that's where my dad worked. There, in that refinery. My mouth watered. I couldn't look away. Robbie and me were eating Weet-Bix at the table when Dad walked into the kitchen. "Morning, boys," he said, his voice croaky with sleep. "Morning, Dad, morning," I said. Robbie barely looked up. He was reading the instructions on the milk bottle. It was just Robbie and the bottle. "Morning," he mumbled. Dad leaned against the island and rubbed his eyes. The skin of his face was still red from the rust. "Might take my coffee down to the shed, love," he said to Mum. "Take a look at that chair." "Good idea, Gav," she said, passing him his cup. "A chair with 3 legs isn't much use, eh?" She smiled. "Good idea, Gav," I said. Dad looked at me and frowned. Then he took his coffee and went through the back door. A horn beeped outside. Robbie took his bowl to the sink and pulled up his football socks. "Mrs. Davids is here," he said, looking through the window. "Good luck for the game," said Mum, grabbing him and squeezing, "and thank Mrs. Davids for the lift." Robbie was 12, 6 years older than me, and Mum's first miracle. Her ovarian was crusted with cysts like barnacles on a boat. I saw a picture on Dr. Eric's wall. The boat was deep in the water and there was hardly any space, only one tiny hole that took me 6 years to find. Her second miracle. Robbie headed for the front door. "Bye, Robbie. Bye. Good luck in the game," I said, but he was already gone. Dad's shed was a garage with a roller door that didn't roll. Dad used the thing door in the side instead. The shed was the one place Mum didn't tidy. "You leave Dad alone when he's in there, Jimmy," she said. I hung around the doorway and looked in at Dad and rode my 3-wheeler up and down the concrete path and onto the grass, then back onto the path, then onto the grass. Dad was drawing something on the wall. I dropped my 3-wheeler and went closer to the open door. He was drawing lines around his tools with a texter. "What are you doing that for, Dad?" I asked him. "Dad?" "So I don't lose my tools, son," he answered. "Look." He took the hammer off the wall. Left behind was the outline of the hammer. Now I know where the hammer should go. I'll know when it's missing. Should have done this years ago. He shook his head, then put the hammer back into the drawing of itself. In the corner of the shed was a small fridge where Dad kept beers. There were stickers on the fridge door, pictures of highways that led to the beach. One said Golden Valley Highway, another said Southern Lands Highway, and one said Great Coastal Road. Some of the stickers had a wave curling over, others had a fish or a fishing rod. The shed was where Dad went to fix things like a chair. I stayed at the open door and watched him where he stood, gripping the chair between his legs, his mouth tight with a nail sticking out, his lips bitten back as he hammered at the place where the leg had snapped. The refinery's magnetic powers streamed through him and drew me. I couldn't leave him alone.
Thank you
That's
so
it.
much, Sophie. That was so beautifully read.
Thank you.
Our next reader will be Christine Keneally, who has been longlisted for her book, The Invisible History of the Human Race. And the judges said of Christine's book that she uses the contemporary enthusiasm for genealogy and family history as an accessible entry point for the general reader, giving us a wonderful assortment of insights into the meaning and value of the past. To read this book is to be in the company of a dynamic, ardent mind, talking in a friendly, authorial voice and never talking down. And thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Veronica. And thank you, everyone who's tuning in tonight. Thank you also to the Stella Prize. This is a fun opportunity, and it's my first reading of the book. So I too am just going to read a little bit from the beginning, and it's kind of the view from 10,000 feet, metaphorically, over the book, although it's actually literally even higher. Okay, so we'll give it a shot. That's the book. There's a moment somewhere between the North Pole and the South when I look out my window and see the top of the Himalayas. At first, the shapes are clouds, but then they resolve into immense snow-covered crags, perfectly still in the cumulus sea. It doesn't matter how many times I've seen them before, I am always surprised. They are proof that I am somewhere very high and very strange. At 30,000 feet, light floods the plain. Ahead, the night drapes across the earth. We barrel toward the darkness, and then we tunnel quickly through it. In a few hours, when we land, it will be morning. I call my boyfriend's attention to the window. CB, look. He wonders if anyone is over there on the mountains. Perhaps there are a few souls right on the tip. But if so, it's just us and them and all the other long-distance flying containers up here. We are tracing the outer edge of the human envelope. Below, 6 billion people inhale. Above, there's nothing to breathe. It's about this point when I'm too tired to read, I've consumed too much wine, and all I can do is stare that the human condition really starts to get to me. Half the plane is unconscious, the other half is gingerly stepping over them, and there is a permanent line to the toilets. In addition to this aerial trip, my boyfriend and I were embarking on a few heady, metaphorical ones as well. We'd met in England and were heading to Melbourne to meet my parents. Maybe at some point we would become parents too. It was momentous to contemplate, and it's a truism that we didn't know the half of it, but we didn't even know what we didn't know. Here's one thing that I didn't know when I was flying above the Indian Ocean. One of my great-great-grandfathers was called Michael Deegan, and 170 years before we got on our plane, he followed a similar trajectory, from high in the northern hemisphere to way down south in the southern. He was only 15 years old, and he crossed the oceans on a bark called the Kinnear. The trip took 105 days. The boat left Dublin with 174 men and arrived in Australia with 172. Deegan had left a country on the edge of a famine in which 1 million people died and 2.5 million fled in 10 years. He'd stolen a handkerchief and was now a convict on the way to Van Diemen's Land. Even if he survived his sentence, he was forbidden to return home. All the Kinnear's passengers boarded as criminals, but many of them disembarked compliant. At the end of the journey, the ship's surgeon entered a report on the character of each of the survivors. Good, orderly, or even very good, yet somehow Deegan remained troublesome. In the 21st century, we move through space in these high-speed vessels and through our lives inside little envelopes of time. Usually we know people from the generation or two that come before us and probably the generation or two that come after. But mortality draws a thick line across the horizon ahead, and existence, or the lack of it, marks the line behind us. It's not common in the West to have met or even know much about anyone born 3 generations before us. Do these people shape us anyway, whether we know about them or not? Humanity itself has been making some consequential moves for a long time now. Over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, we populated Africa, then we left the continent in waves and spread across the world. The global travel that began more than 60,000 years ago continued for the next 45,000 years before we settled every habitable continent on Earth. From the 9th century, when Vikings set out to sea in longboats, through the ages of expansion, slavery, the spice trade, and the colonialism that ended in the 20th century, thousands of ships crossed the oceans. The vessels carried explorers, prisoners, slaves, and immigrants far away from the places where they were born, in most cases never to return. In the second half of the 19th century, now known as the age of mass migration, the movement peaked with more than 55 million emigrants embarking from the Old World and heading to the Americas and Australia. On the human scale, the ships marked crucial chapters in the lives of many individuals and in the lives of everyone who descended from them. Culturally, they changed the stories of family forever. Biologically, the ships delivered mixed samples of human genomes. Everywhere they went, they transformed the human landscape, releasing new variants into the local gene pool, creating never-before-seen mixes of human material, and founding novel lineages that branched and then branched again. We ourselves are vessels. Inside each cell that is inside each person is a massive library of DNA, 3 billion base pairs that have been passed down to us. I think about this while I sit on the plane. The principle is true for all 466 of my fellow passengers. No matter what class they're in or their reasons for travel, they all carry their great-great-grandparents inside, and they carry traces of their grandparents' ancestors too. Here in this plane are multitudes, 1.4 trillion base pairs that have been passed down through history by millions of people. It's a miracle we ever got off the ground. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. That was really, really interesting. Our next reader is Maxine Vannevar-Clark, who is longlisted for her short story collection, Foreign Soil. And the judges in their report said, although these are stories about inequalities of power in the intersections of class and race, Vannevar-Clark also uses narrative voices and the effects of dialogue to show characters attempting to create and assert a coherent self through the power of speech. Her work is profoundly political, but it is also more than that. And I'll just hand over to Maxine, who's in the room with me.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the reading so far. I'm going to read from a story in Foreign Soil called Big Island, Island without the D. And it's a piece that's written in Jamaican patois. Nathaniel Robinson lean out over the water, shake him head, and look down past him grubby dungarees and him heavy leather work boot and into the water below. Him a large man, Nathaniel, big bone, like him bloodline done come right down from Goliath in the Bible or something. Large. And if you know how gentle the man is at heart, then maybe him even seem a little ominous, standing on the pier like this, with him black shadow casting down over the light blue of the bay water below. Kingston port near changed. It's same as it always is in the easy afternoon after him knock off down the docks. Same as it always is every weekday afternoon, when the young man stand on the edge of this beloved island country of his, looking out to sea. Same blue pon green pon navy pon khaki water, same flat horizon line that seem like it's stretching way beyond what him eye can see, running and running forever and a day. Same familiar husky whisper of the sea breeze, dancing and teasing around them broad black shoulder that hidden beneath him torn work shirt and him baggy overalls. Same Kingston. Small air bubble, traveling slowly up out the water as them fast-tail fishy flit just below the surface. When Nathaniel a sigh, and squint peer past the ships, it the same seaweed shadow patterned out in the getting deep reaches, and the same yellow afternoon glinting off the ripples, that same crazy fresh island air, so clear despite the many cargo ship out the place this evening, that every breath feel like it flowing down to the very bottom of him lung and coming up new and reborn. Same everything, but yet somehow it near the same anymore at all. It big change. Since him learn J for Jamaica, everything around Nathaniel seem like it near quite the same. Since him learn J for Jamaica, the ocean been calling, near calming the young man. The sun seemed shifted somehow. Him used to feel it blaring warm on him back in the hot season, covering him gentle like an old childhood blanket and making him feel safe and protected. Now, more often than not, him find the sun in him eye and himself squinting away the sheer annoyance of it. Ever since Nathaniel learned J for Jamaica, the fishy seem a little less translucent. Tiny schools of them, dizzy swimming in circles and not with the same purpose anymore. Ever since J, them fancy cargo ship been passing through Kingston, not coming to or leaving from it. Ever since him learned J for Jamaica, much as him continue to tell himself nothing changed, Nathaniel carrying a small amount of unease, deep, deep down in him own self-skin. 1 letter per week, him wife Clarice had insisted. Was 12 months back. The woman was standing at the kitchen bench preparing them Sunday meal. We starting with A for Aki, she said, her fingers removing the blushing crimson flower from the outside of the Aki, snapping off the cedar black seed at the end of the cream color fruit. Him wife, she had him trace that first letter 100 damn times in the lounge room while she cooking up the food. Nathaniel's large frame was crouched down on the floor, hunched around the glass coffee table. Clarice's parents brought the table for them wedding present 3 years back. A is for Aki, she said. Him clumsy finger clutching tight and awkward round the grey lead. The little letter A was a round circle with a stick attached on the right-hand side. The big letter A, the capital one she called it, was pointy at the top like it's some kind of arrow. And Lord, him sure once stabbed the woman with it that evening, she frustrated him so. A is also for acrimonious. Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you, Maxine. Our next long-listed author is Emily Bitto, who's long-listed for her novel The Strays. And the judges said of The Strays, while it's partly inspired by the real-life 1930s artist colony at Heide in Melbourne, this novel's characters and plot are wholly fictional, and the result is a satisfyingly cohesive vision and story. With its reflective tone, rhythmic style, and vivid scenes, Bitto's novel illuminates the history of a particular time, place, and way of living, but it also draws out the more abstract themes common to all times and places of friendship, memory, ambition, and family life. And now over to you, Emily, to introduce your reading. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm also just going to read from the very start of my novel, just a really short section. I once read that the heart's magnetic field radiates up to 5 meters from the body, so that whenever we are within this range of another person, our hearts are interacting. The body's silent communications with other bodies are unmapped and mysterious, a linguistics of scent, colour, flashes of heat, the dilating of a pupil. Who knows? What we call instant attraction may be as random as the momentary synchrony of 2 hearts' magnetic pulses. Eva's mother believed in past life connections, that 2 souls can be twinned over and over, playing out different roles, so that in one life they may be mother and daughter, in another husband and wife, in a third dear friends. I only know that throughout my life I've felt an instinctive attraction to particular people, male and female, romantic and platonic. Attraction inexplicable at the time, but for a certain mutual recognition. It was this way with Eva, although we were only 8 years old. I remember that day after it all fell apart, when Eva came to me through the misty garden, so that her red coat bled into view, from white to pale rose to scarlet, the pride I felt, that I was the one she turned to, that I could give her what her own family could not. All those years as part of the Trenthams' lives, feeling loved but never needed, never family. I am an only child. It is my lot to be envious, even grasping, to long for the bonds that tie sisters together, the fearless, unthinking acceptance that we are social creatures, pack animals, that there is never, truly, the threat of being alone. I'm sitting outside at the wooden table, marking student essays when I hear the tidy creak and clap as the letter slot opens and shuts its mouth. I shuffle the papers into a pile, set them on a chair and walk through the open French doors, across the lounge room and down the hallway, lit cobalt by the panels of glass that flank the front door. The envelope is narrow and rust-coloured, shot through with metallic strands. Inside is an invitation that I recognise immediately to the opening of Evan Trentham's retrospective at the National Gallery of Victoria. Tucked behind it is a sheet of notepaper folded into 3. I open it and see Eva's loose, sloping handwriting, unchanged, though that some part of my mind slips, unsure if I'm a middle-aged woman standing in her hallway in blue light, or if I'm a girl again. Beyond the front door I hear a man and a child walk past the gate, the man's head swimming rippled across the panel of glass, the child's voice falling indistinct from a high note like the carol of a magpie. I turn and walk back through the blue tunnel of the past towards the clear kitchen, reading as I go.
Thanks, Em, that was lovely. Our next reader is Joan London, who's longlisted for her book The Golden Age. And the judges said of The Golden Age that it's a story of exile, transition and resilience. It shows the power of vocation and the fragility of love. And in its account of how it feels to belong to a displaced, marginalised and vulnerable race recently threatened with genocide, it has some delicate reverberations for the oldest Australians as well as for the newest. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. We can, yes.
Okay. I'm going to read from the beginning as well. Light. One afternoon during rest time, the new boy, Frank Gold, left his bed, lowered himself into his wheelchair and glided down the corridor. There was nobody around. It was early December, already hot, and Frank, veteran by now of hospital life, knew the nurses would be upstairs in front of their fan. The door to Sister Penny's office was closed. She'd be catching 40 winks on her couch. His first goal, as usual, was to set eyes on Elsa. He peered into girls through the crack between the hinges of the half-open door. Elsa's bed was behind the door. He liked to see her face asleep. Even if her head was turned away into the pillow, the sight of her thick gold-brown plait somehow gave him hope. But this afternoon her bed was empty. He rolled on past the silent kitchen with its bare scrubbed benches. Even the flies were sleeping. It was as if the whole place were under a spell. Only he had escaped. He'd been waiting for this moment. In his pocket was a cigarette and a little sheaf of matches stolen from his mother during her last visit. She'd slipped off to have a word with Sister Penny, leaving her handbag on his bed. Later, he thought of her standing on the station platform in the twilight, delving for her matches, dying for a smoke. Visits upset Eva. She didn't come every week. But the act of taking them was like reclaiming something. He was turning back into his old, sneaky self. He felt suddenly at ease, in charge again. Sneakiness was a form of privacy, and privacy here was the first loss. A resistance to the babyishness of this place, its pygmy toilets, its naps and rules, half hospital, half nursery school, and his feeling of demotion when he was sent here. "We are so very glad to have you," Sister Penny had said firmly when the ambulance delivered him. "The younger children do look up to the older ones as examples." Frank searched her radiant face and knew there was nothing there for him to test. Everything had been resolved a long time ago. He felt like a pirate landing on an island of little maimed animals. A great wave had swept them up and dumped them here, all of them like him, stranded, wanting to go home. Now he was gliding down the ramp of the covered way, past the new treatment block, out to the clotheslines, hidden behind a wire trellis, the only place where he wouldn't be seen. The washing had been taken in, dried stiff by lunchtime. The ceaseless rumbling and throbbing of the netting factory across the road was louder out here. It was like entering the territory of a huge caged animal. Even the white glare cheered him. Ever since the fever of polio had subsided, light had seemed less bright to him, older, sadder. Moments of solitude were rare and must be grasped with both hands. He put the cigarette into his mouth and struck the row of flimsy matches, one after another. Sweat trickled into his eyes. His hands shook. He wanted, unreasonably, to curse Ida. A man's shadow blocked out the glare. A huge pair of red hands was cupping a lick of flame. Light? Norm Whitehouse growled. Frank inhaled. His head spun. His heart surged with love. He knew now why everyone loved Norm, the gardener, who just as silently ambled off, as if to say, a man has a right to a smoke in peace. The next moment the cigarette was stubbed out on the post of the washing line and thrown across the fence. Frank thought he might be sick. Dizzy, blinded, he veered back down the dark corridor, heaved himself onto the bed. His body was not a normal boy's anymore. He wasn't a little kid either, smelling of soap, asleep like those around him. Yet after a while, as his heart slowed, a smile spread across his face. He could still hear the rumble of Norm's voice. Light? He may as well have said life, but where was Elsie? That's it.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was really wonderful. Thank you. Our next reader is Alice Kung, who will be reading from Lorinda, which is her young adult novel. And the judges said of Lorinda that this novel is much more than just a story of high school. It explores the workings of class conflict and racial difference in a hothouse atmosphere. And it's an incisive critique of the limitations of a privileged upbringing. Formerly categorised as young adult, this novel is an equally compelling read for adults, skillfully written and full of insight and ideas. And now Alice will read to us.
Thanks, Veronica. So this is a scene set in an art exhibition at a high school. It's a very private and very prestigious high school. I'll just start reading. At the exhibition, we went around looking at paintings and sculptures on themes such as despair and anorexia and war, while the boys snaked their way around us in sniggering huddles. Basically, we pretended they were there to inconvenience us, blocking our view. Gina was the only one making it obvious that she was excited to be around the opposite sex. Others were more discreet, although I noticed the cabinet were not immune to the charms of the Auburn boys. So the Auburn is the boys' school. They had begun acting coy. You'd never think that those were the same girls who'd planned world domination in politics class. I happened to be standing near them beside a sculpture of a pink paper mache brain with electrical wires jutting out from it when an Asian boy with glasses walked by. Amber nudged me. Look, there's one for you. She and Chelsea giggled. It was incredible how they assumed that I would not be interested in any other type of boy, but that's how they were. In their white daisy bouquet of slim pickings, they cast out all the yellow chrysanthemums, and anything brown was considered wilted. Hashan had skin the colour of a violin and an earring in one ear. I noticed it as he leaned over to poke a finger at one of the wires of the brain sculpture. When Chelsea spoke to him, she didn't ask what he thought of the sculpture. Instead, she seemed to want to foster some cultural cohesion by asking, "So what part of India are you from?" "I was born here, actually," he said in a friendly way. "My parents are Sri Lankan, from Fiji." Even someone like Hashan was not immune to the charms of the cabinet girls I saw, particularly with Amber standing there. Here was the thing about the accidental artwork of her face. A few millimetres off and her eyes would be set too close together, a few millimetres apart, and her mouth would make her chin look sunken. It was this tenuousness that made her so hot, that made boys feel like they were living on the edge just by looking at her. "Same diff," said Amber, and she and Chelsea giggled. They were flirting with him. They assumed Hashan understood they were not racist because they deigned to speak to him, but they had no real idea what the difference between Sri Lanka and India was, and making it worse, they didn't care. One was Gilmati and the other was Gandhi. We didn't study South Asian history at this school. "Ignorant bitches," he muttered under his breath. "Excuse me," Amber's eyes widened. "What did you call us?" Chelsea turned towards him. That is so offensive. Oh my God. Gee, some people can't take a joke, she pouted. I could see that she was wounded because her eyes glittered like anthracite. Suddenly, it seemed, this was all Hashan's fault. He was the brute insulting these two young diplomats who meant well, who were curious about his culture. They were nice girls, and he was a condescending, sexist pig. Hashan looked down at them, and I could tell that all the beauty he'd seen before there had dissolved. And then he did something completely unexpected, which made them squeal. He lowered his head and bowed from the waist, a long, drawn-out bow that came to just above the hem of their skirts, his back straight as an ironing board. He slowly came up and held his hands on the prayer position. Bobbing his head from side to side, he said, "Oh, golly gee, ma'am, I'm really, really sorry. Please accept my most humble apologies." His face was hard, but unlike Chelsea's, it was not brittle. He turned and walked away. Amber and Chelsea burst into laughter. "Stupid curry muncher," said Chelsea, and then told a story about how guys like that were always trying to pick her up at Urban Nightclub and how they couldn't dance for shit. I moved away from the brain sculpture.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was wonderful. Our next reader is Inga Simpson, who will be reading from her novel Nest. And the judges said of Nest, Inga Simpson is known for her nature writing, and this novel's most unusual aspect is the frequency with which the plot takes a back seat to the minutiae of plant and bird life, the things that most concern Jen in her artistic persona, about which Simpson writes in fine and gorgeous detail. The central metaphor of the nest is ever present, but is neither simple nor overdone. She handles her subject matter lightly and obliquely, with subtlety and a real understanding of the psychology of loss and grief. And now Inga will read to us from Nest. Oh, Inga, you're still on mute.
Is that better?
Yep, that's wonderful.
Am I good?
All good. Good to go.
I'm just saying I've had 2 system crashes tonight already, so if I just fade to black, I didn't forget my lines. Yeah, my laptop is had its day, I think. One of her father's most overused pieces of advice had been don't look back. As it turned out, it wasn't just his usual half-assed attempt at wisdom, but a way of life. Her friend Michael had always looked back. From his desk in front of hers, over his shoulder as he was marched off to the principal's office, or from the rear window of the car when picked up after school. He always dragged out his goodbyes. That afternoon, when they had parted ways at the end of the street running down to the Oval, he had given her a salute, like a young soldier off to war. It was just football practice, but he wasn't the star he wanted to be, limited by his size. Some of the older boys had been picking on him, probably for hanging out with her. She had kept walking up the road to home as if it were any other day. The sun hung low, bathing the valley in golden light, and a string of black cockatoos flew overhead, their wings moving in slow time. Their cries had not sounded at all mournful, the way they did to her now. Wood smoke from freshly lit fires was heavy on the air. The whine of chainsaws, her father's among them, carried from just outside of town. The hinterland had been different then, their part of it anyway. Time had moved more slowly. People either lived there all their lives or just passed through on their way further north for their summer holidays. It was the land time forgot. There were no organic cafes, galleries or Thai restaurants, just a caravan park and the giant water slide. People struggled along, working a few jobs, selling their pineapples, strawberries and macadamias from roadside stalls, with honesty boxes that did not need bolting down. The biggest harvest then was still trees, food for the mills. As she had learned since, the moments that most change your life, you never see coming. Your position from deep within the movement the shift itself, does not permit a clear view. It is just a feeling, a sense of the ground loosening beneath your feet. With hindsight, you see that you did know somehow, that you had felt a profound unease, but something in your own mind prevented you from piecing it together, perhaps to protect you for as long as possible. Jen had dawdled, as usual, dragging a stick along the driveway. The chainsaws had stopped, leaving the valley quiet. She had kicked off her school shoes at the back door and thrown her bag into the laundry, done her chores with the minimum of effort, lied and said she had no homework. She was supposed to be working on some stupid science project, but didn't know where to start. When her father finally pulled in, she rang to hug him, his jeans pale with sawdust, his plaid shirt sharp with sap and sweat. He lifted her above his head, as if she was still small, although his great arms must already have been tired. She had swallowed down her mother's casserole, scraping the sauce off the squares of meat and wrapping each one in mashed potato, so she would be allowed to watch the Sullivans. Afterwards, she had read under the covers with a torch, long past lights out, and fallen asleep with the untroubled mind of a child. The second day, Michael's wooden seat sat empty. Her whole class was sent home from school. The principal edged into the room and made the announcement, his voice calm but sweat rings spreading out from under his arms. Their teacher, Miss Lander, handed out tissues, though she was in greatest need of them herself. Most of them had been together since prep and would have preferred to see out the rest of the day as one, but parents had been called. Except hers, it seemed. There was no one waiting for her outside the school, so she started up the road on foot. Mandy's mother pulled over and insisted on driving her. She couldn't remember if they spoke in the car. Sound had been muted out, and most of the colour. Her father's red truck wasn't in the driveway, even though it was his day off. The dogs hadn't been fed. The breakfast dishes were still on the bench, black with ants. Mum? Her mother was sitting at the dining table, amid a strew of bills, crying. Jen lifted the phone in the hall to find no dial tone. He's gone, her mother said. Jen blinked. Michael? He's left us, honey. There was a half-empty glass of wine on the table, in a pool of condensation. Her mother had forgotten all about Michael. Something fell away inside. Jen tried to catch it and jam it back, to stop the rush of realisation, the terrible clicking into place of all those images and pieces of information. But it was no good. Daddy wasn't coming home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inga. We're so glad that your computer held on, because that was a really, really wonderful reading. We have two more authors reading tonight, and our next reader is Ellen Van Nieuwen. Ellen is longlisted for the Stella Prize for Heat and Light, which is a story collection in 3 parts. And the judges said of Heat and Light, Van Nieuwen moves with ease between realism and fantasy, using elements of myth and mysticism. Myth and mysticism in her storytelling. From one story to the next, the content is always rich and suggestive, and the writing is always beautiful and clever. Each of these stories is told with passion and conviction. Van Nieuwen writes with the confidence, maturity, and subtlety of someone twice her age, and with startling originality. And now Ellen will read to us from Heat and Light.
Thanks, Veronica. Good evening. I'm going to read from a section at the beginning of the book, which is told by a character called Amy. Amy's just found out that her grandmother, her biological grandmother, is not the woman that she thought she was, and so she's really reflecting on that change, and really it's about, as much as we find out about family, in turn influences who we are, and particularly when this information has been hidden from us, it can really affect our emotional landscape and in turn how we choose to love. So much is in what we make of things. The stories we construct about our place in our families are essential to our lives. My father still won't say anything about it. He refuses to admit that Pearl is his mother. I make him have a break from the painting and sit him down at the kitchen table and try to convince him to accept the truth. I guess he doesn't want to know that his mother didn't want him, and all of the other things she was. But I think she was a fighter. I think there's a lot of struggle in our family, and she has passed on that strength. I don't know yet if she's alive or dead, at peace or not, but I know she deserves to be part of our family's history. On the way home, I find a lover in a hotel in a one-street country town. She smells like apricots and is too pure for me. I started surfing when I realized that I needed something to quell my undiagnosed sex addiction. When I go out to the beach, it's usually to clear my head from anyone muddled up in there. Mystery does not always equal desire, and for every woman I've been with, there's been one that's turned me down. Like that Fleetwood Mac song, Women, they will come and they will go. This woman doesn't turn me down. We giggle as we pay the clerk for a room upstairs. As she unlocks the door, I search her hands for a ring or a tattoo or some sort of sign that will remind me that she's not mine. She's the kind of girl I would have thought about being with when I was younger and hadn't yet fucked up. She gardens and she volunteers at the school near Hugh Hill, where lots of my mob went. She says she'll take me to the farm where she lives and show me her orange trees. They are the biggest oranges, the size of basketballs, and they taste like love. Will you cut them up for me? I ask. Yes, she says, looking off her silhouette top. And take the skin off? Of course. We take the covers off the bed and she gently puts her hand on my chest and drives me back onto the mattress. She lowers herself and her legs come around my waist. I squeeze her ankles and we kiss like we've kissed each other before. How can it be that I don't feel the weight of her, that there is no taste on her tongue, no drug, no cigarette, no alcohol or coffee? I thought she'd taste like apricots or oranges. I'm getting sick. It must be the flu I resisted all winter, because I can't continue. My breath is ragged and the shapes and the colours of her are blurring. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ellen. That was really, really gorgeous. And now we are up to our final reading. Our final reader is Biff Ward, who'll be reading from her memoir, In My Mother's Hands. The Stella judges said of In My Mother's Hands, this memoir is a moving and disquieting account of life in a family where silence ruled and nobody felt safe, but where everyone remained as loyal and even as loving as they could. Ward's story of her family, and especially of her mother, is full of insight and frank intelligence, and shows what terrible stress and struggle sometimes went on behind closed doors in an era that stigmatised mental illness and idealised traditional family life. Biff, would you like to read and introduce your reading for us, please?
Thank you. And hello to everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm sorry I was late. It was a technical thing. So I'm just going to read a prologue again from the beginning, but it's very short, so I'm going to read just a couple of other lines from the second part. There is in my family a grave that was never visited. When I was a child, I knew that somewhere, over several hills in another part of Sydney, there was a cemetery where the baby had been buried and left. My parents never went to it, as far as I knew, and the one time I tried to, I was quickly put right. I was 8 and home from school with a cold. My mother and I got talking about the baby, who died before I was born, and about the grave. It wasn't that far away. It was actually close enough to visit. So we became excited, my mother and I, about going to the grave. Do you want to take flowers, she said. Oh, can we? Yes, I answered. Violets. I wanted to make a bunch, a pom-pom of purple flowers surrounded by shiny green leaves, the perfect posy, the kind men sold on street corners in those days, an offering suitable for a baby. And there were violets growing in our backyard. My mother's clever fingers held the stems together while I tied them with a ribbon. When I held what we'd made in my hand, it was almost as I'd pictured it. We walked together, collected Mark from the infant school, and then waited across the road for Dad, watching the big boys stream out of the high school building. We waited to surprise him. "Dad," I called, "look, I've got flowers." He crossed the road, his face a mix. Delighted to see us so unexpectedly, perplexed as to why we were there, his little family, waiting in a bunch. He stepped onto the footpath. "We're going to see the grave," my mother said. She was smiling, her lips all wobbly. As he took it in, he glared at her, and thunder broke over our heads. "Don't be bloody ridiculous," he snapped. "Don't be mad," he added, turning his back resolutely against the direction where the tram lay. "We're going home," and he took her arm with his knuckles white and turned us back towards Avenue Road. We set off, a silent troop, my violet posy drooping, pointing to my trudging feet. That night at tea, Dad ate his soup without a word. We all watched, waiting for a sign, something that would explain, something that would bring him back. He left the table and went to his desk and stayed there instead of reading to us like he usually did. Next day, I didn't hold his hand on the way to school. I joined up with some other kids, and we walked behind him, the tall figure with the battered brown kit bag, holding a class full of English essays and his lunch of tomato sandwiches. As it turned out, I didn't get to see the grave until 40 years later. So that's the prologue, and there's just a few lines here on page 5, which I think sums up the whole book. Dad was never beige. If he were a colour, it would be a rich maroon, a gleaming claret like the livery of his school days at Prince Alfred College in Adelaide. Mum, on the other hand, inhabited the soft end of the yellow spectrum, ranging from a faint cream through the pastels to rare flashes of daffodil. Later, when we were older, there were the orange-red times. Thanks.
Thank you, Viv. We're so glad you could make it.
Yes.
That was our final reading for tonight. Thank you so much to everyone who watched, and to our wonderful Stella longlisted authors, those who were here and those who weren't. Thank you also to the Digital Writers Festival. So just a reminder, tonight we had readings from Sophie Laguna, Christine Keneally, Maxine Benaber-Clark, Emily Bitto, Joan London, Alice Pung, Inga Simpson, Ellen Van Nieven, and that was Biff Ward. The Stella Prize shortlist for 2015 will be announced at 12 noon Australian Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday, 12th of March, and the 2015 prize will be awarded in Melbourne on the evening of Tuesday, 21st of April. So you still have a fair bit of time to go out and buy all those books from your local bookseller and make sure you read them. And thank you once again to everybody for watching.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, authors. Bye-bye.
Bye.